Hello all. In this video we are going to talk about classes and objects, and this is basically an intro to object-oriented programming, OOP. So what is a class? What is an object? So a class is a user-defined type of data that has its own data and its own functions. So it's self-contained basically. And when you want to do anything with a class, what you do is, class is like a blueprint. Okay, it's like the genetic map. So you use it, and any basically thing that you create out of that class, you call it an object. So object is anything that you create from a blueprint of a class. Okay, it's a basically, I would say, an instance of that class. We call it an object. So in order to create classes, you start with the keyword class, you give that class a name, and then inside the braces you provide the data and you provide what the methods or the functions. Now, the methods and the data in a class can be of three different types, which we call them access modifiers, these keywords: public, private, and protected. So your data and functions could be public, which means they can be accessed from outside the class. So this is your class. It starts here and it ends here right before you start your main function. And now if you want to, let's say, provide the data for this class, you can do it outside the class. What does that mean? Well, let me show you. So here, this box has three public data, which are length, width, and height. And what is this box, by the way? This box is an object. It's a cube. It's a box. And this box has three major dimensions: length, width, and height. These are the public data of this box, which means if I want to set a value for these three variables, I can do it from outside this object box, and I can change them also. So I can set up them, I can access them, I can change them from outside. And what does that mean? Well, if you look here, inside my basically main function, I created an object box1 of category box. So this box1 is like one box out of so many boxes, right? And then I provide the value for the length, width, and height, and I give them values of 4, 5, and 3. So you see, I can, from outside this object box here, I can set up the values for it, right? Or another way I'll show you in a minute is I can use the dot operator to do that, okay? And I can also change them if I want to. Okay, so this is called a public data or a public function. So they can be accessed from outside the class. Now, if you declare something private, it means that thing cannot be accessed outside the class. It can only, that data, let's say if that data is private, that data can only be accessed with the functions inside the class. So here I have another data called multiplier. And this multiplier, if I want to see how much it is, or if I want to change it, I cannot do it with any command that here I put in my main function. No command can access that value, no command can change it. So how can you change it? Using the functions inside the class. So here I have two functions that I have written for it. One of them is gonna set that value, which means change it or assign something to it. And the other one is just gonna return that value, is gonna get it, okay? So the set and get are very common in most of the basically objects and classes. So you see, these functions are defined inside the class. They are a part of this class, and only those guys can access it and can change it, okay? Nothing outside can do that. That's called a private member. And then we have something called protected, which means those data or those members are not accessible outside, but they can be accessed by a subclass or a children, basically. And subclass or children is the topic that we're going to see in the next video. when we talk about inheritance. So let's keep this protected discussion to another video. So here, if something is private, whether data or function, we say private, and then we say column, and then we type the data, and if it's a function, we write the function, okay? So if there is a function here, we can type it here, right? But right now, there is no private function. There is only some private what? Some private data, okay? That's all it is. Then if there is something public, now we say public, and then under public, we write all of the public data and functions. So here, there are 3 public data, length, width, and height, and there are several functions that are public. So 2 of them I explained to you. These are to set and get the values of the private function. These are specifically for that purpose. But there are 3 other functions that I need to explain for you. The first one is called the constructor. Okay, it's called the constructor, and it's not necessarily mandatory for each class to have a constructor. So constructors are special cases, special members, special functions that are called every time you want to instantiate or create an object from a class. They have the same name as the name of the class. So the class name is box. The name of this function is also what? Box. Before the constructor, I'm not going to type anything. I'm not going to say double. I'm not going to say void. I'm not going to say anything. So no type is provided. Let me add some more information for you here. No type is provided for a constructor function. Okay, that's one thing. And the other thing is constructors are not mandatory to have. Okay, constructors are not mandatory. Not mandatory functions. In other words, you can use a class and you can create an object from it without having a constructor function. Okay, so you don't have to have them, and I'll show you in a minute how. So you can just comment this whole part out. So what does this construction do? All it is, it takes the value when you call this guy, it takes the value of X, Y, and Z, the public data, and it gets them as X, Y, and Z, and then assign those X, Y, and Z to the actual public data, which are length, width, and height. So whenever you call this with 3 numbers, X, Y, Z, it assigns those 3 numbers to length, width, and height, and that's exactly what you're doing right here. You see here, when I call this box 1, which is of type box, I'm actually calling what? The constructor here. So it says instantiate an object by calling its constructor function. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm giving X, Y, and Z 4, 5, and 3, and then when I call this, it is going to assign them to length, width, and height. This is one way that you can give the values for what? For length, width, and height. There is an alternative way that you can do it, and I mentioned that over here for you. So if you do not have a constructor, basically this function is all commented out like this. So if you have this, right, there is no construction function, then instead of creating an object from the class using calling the constructor, what would you do? You go ahead and you do it this way. You create the object, but don't pass any data to it. You just create the object and then use the dot operator. You say box 1, which is the object, dot length is 4, dot width is 5, dot height is 3. Can I do that? Yes. Why? Because these 3 numbers are what? They are public numbers. I can access them, I can set them, I can change them from what? From outside the class, outside the object, right? So I can do it that way. This way would also what? Would also work, and I'll show you that, right? So let me go back. So that's called the constructor, initializing the public values and creating a sample object. The other function I have here is to calculate the volume of the box. So it multiplies length, width, and height together. And here it multiplies the volume by a modifier, by a multiplier. And this multiplier in this case is that hidden factor, is that hidden number 1.1. So basically, instead of giving x times y times z, you multiply them by a number and give it a modified volume. Okay, so this volume is actually a what? Is calculate a modified volume, which basically you consider some extra volume because, for example, maybe you're measuring x, y, and z smaller than what it is, or because maybe your box has some flexibility, and if you put more stuff in it, it can change its size or anything for that matter. Here I have an extra parameter called multiplier, and this function calculate volume will give me that number. It returns that number. Okay, now how does this function access that private value of multipliers? Well, first of all, it can do it because this function is inside the class, so it can access the private data. How does it access the private data? It uses that getVal function. It calls that utility getVal function, and it gives it the multiplier, and then it multiplies that by everything else. Not only it can do that, not only it can get that value, actually using the setValue function, it can change that multiplier. So look here, I started my multiplier at 1.1, but if I want, I can change it to what? 1.2. So when I do that, that is equivalent to saying multiplier is equal to what? 1.2, so I can change it as well inside here, right? So this function gives me a modified volume. I talked about all of those. And finally, I have something called a destructor, which is the opposite of constructor, and the job of it is to remove that object from memory and release the memory when that object is no longer in use or in scope. The way that you create a destructor function is you put the name of the class and in empty parentheses, and behind that you use a tilde. That's all you need to do. And this one will create what? Will remove, will eliminate that object box that is no longer in use. Now, this part here, this line here is not mandatory. So this line of code is not mandatory. You can just leave it blank. You can just literally say something like this. Nothing between the braces. You don't need to run any command. And this is just for information. It's just to tell the user, hey, destructor applied, your object is gone from the memory. You don't have to do it. It is gonna eliminate the object whether you put that line there or not, because this is just a display of a message. Okay, so these are my functions and data of my class, and then finally you finish your class definition and put semicolon to finish up the class. Now, how do I use this? So I defined this class with all of this. How do I use it in real life? First thing is you create an object from that class. So the class is called box. Instead of saying integer box, right? Instead of saying integer, I say this data box one is of what? Is of class box. It's like arrays, remember? You said I have some array of some integer and 5 and something, right? Remember when we used the class array or we used the class vector? Do you remember these in one of my previous lectures? So that's the same thing. This array or this vector, these are also what? These are classes. These are classes and they have methods, they have functions. So here this box is something similar. It is a class. It's a type of data, user-defined data. It's a type of data I have created myself. So I say create a box and set the values of length, width, and height to 4, 5, and 3. Then go ahead and call the calculate volume function for this box 1, and the value it returns store it in volume. Also call the function getVal for box 1, so it returns what for you? So it returns that multiplier, right? And then what? Show this message to the user that the volume of a box with size 3, 4, and 5, right, with a multiplier of mult is equal to that volume. So let me run this. So it says the volume of a box with size 3, 4, and 5 with a multiplier of 1.2 is, of course, 3 times 4 times 5, which is 60. 60 times 1.2 is what? 72. So this is the result of these 2 lines of code. Right? The first line gave me that 72. The second line gave me that multiplier 1.2. And I use them in here and here. And then you see after that it has another message that destructor applied. What is this? Now that this object box 1 is used and the function is over and there is nothing else, no loop, nothing, the code is over, the function destructor is automatically called, and this line is also what? Shown to you, so you know that, hey, object box 1 is cleaned out of the memory because the destructor of the class was applied. If I didn't have that line, still object box 1 at the end of this main function will be removed from the memory, but since I don't see anything here, it's not easy to tell, right, whether it has applied or not. I'm sure it is, but this line here will confirm it for you that it was applied. Okay, so this is the whole idea of class. And now, as I told you, constructors are not mandatory. So I can comment out the constructor section, the function, and instead of me calling the constructor and setting up the values of public data this way, I can go ahead and what? Declare the object, instantiate the object, and then to set up those public values, I use the dot operator. So I say box1.length.width.height. Directly go ahead and set up those numbers without need for a constructor function. So I can do my code exactly this way. And look here, if I run it, it should give me the exact same result. Except here I need 2 of these. There we go. You see? The exact same thing is applied. The only last part you might say is, what happened to the multiplier? Why is it 1.2? It used to be 1.1 on the top of this code. Yes, when I started at 1.1, but guess what? Here, I'm going to set the value of it to what? To 1.2. I'm changing it. You might not even start it like that. You might just declare it and not give it any value. Just declare it a what? A private data, and then here inside your calculate volume, go ahead and set the value to what? 1.2. That does the exact same thing. So you don't need to start it with a number. Why? Because inside this function volume, you are going to what? You are going to set up a value for it. Now, when is it that it's good to give it a number? Is if there is another function that is going to use that multiplier and that function does not run the setVal function, then nothing is going to set up a number for this. And you might say, if nothing is going to give this multiplier a value, how much is going to be the value of it if you don't start something, if you don't assign a number to this? If you use it somewhere, what is going to be, right? So if I don't do this, basically, if I comment this out, right, give it no value, and initially I didn't give it any value, what do you think is this number multiplier gonna be when I call getVal to get it? How much is gonna be implemented in this? Take a look. It's gonna be 0. Look, you see? So if you don't assign it anywhere or initially or anywhere, then it is gonna be starting at 0. Just keep that in mind. Interesting, huh? So just keep that in mind, that you need to set the value for it somewhere, and it's not a bad idea that initially you started at something. Okay, and wherever you want, you can go ahead and change it. So hopefully this video was useful to you, and I will see you in my next lecture. Thank you.